get this meeting called to order. We just have a couple of items on the agenda. This was originally a study session night for us, and so we have the first up on the agenda. I will just comment that there's no one signed up to speak for public comment on the agenda tonight. So we'll jump right down to 3A, which is a drainage study report, which will, I think, provided by Zach Henson.
All right. Good evening, Council. Good evening, Mayor. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let me know if it works appropriately.
Yep.
All right. So my name is Zach Henson. I'm the Stormwater Program Manager. I work out of the Engineering Department under Monty Carnes. And tonight, got a little presentation. We're just going to talk about some of the things that we've been working on lately. It's an appropriate time of year considering we're coming into the springtime and we are likely to get some rainfall again this year. So we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, to define stormwater management, it is basically the effort to manage the impacts of runoff caused by rainwater or melted snow and ice, and the improvement of water quality. It is directly related to floodplain management and hazard mitigation. And we all work closely together and work on many projects together to work on public safety and water quality. To start off, we'll talk about the stormwater program funding. If you are a resident within the city of Stillwater, you'll notice a drainage fee on the bottom of your utility bill. It generates approximately $300,000 per year in revenue. $1 flat fee charged for residential properties, and then we have a $5 up to a $55 tiered rate structure for commercial properties. This was established in 1997 as a way to generate funds for capital drainage projects. Since that time, we have received some federal and state mandates that have required us to kind of divert that money into regulatory compliance. So it's stretched very thin. It has not been updated since 1997, and we are doing the best we can with it. It is split between 3 different departments. Community development gets a share, and that goes towards the cost of permitting and other administrative costs with new development. A portion of it goes to stormwater as part of the administration for the MS4 program. We'll get a little bit more into the MS4 program and what all is entailed with that. And then the other department that receives a piece of that pie is Public Works, and they have the actual task of drainage maintenance. They have a 2-man drainage crew, and they are responsible for responding to complaints such as blocked culverts, trees blocking creeks, things of that nature. So they are running pretty ragged most of the time with only 2 of them, and Public Works does a fantastic job of helping out with budget. I know that the share that they get does not cover everything, that all the costs that they encumber, and they do a fantastic job of working with us and making sure that we get done what we need to get done. So to get into stormwater management, there are primarily 2 aspects. One side, we look at water quality, and the other side, we look at water quantity. So we'll start off with water quality first, and I'll go ahead and define MS4. That stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, and MS4 is the abbreviation used by federal and state agencies. And the reason we have water quality regulations is because 55% of the U.S. streams and rivers are in poor condition. And I want to point out that that is 55% of surveyed U.S. streams and rivers, because we have several water bodies that have not been tested. We don't have data for them. And we have found that polluted stormwater runoff is a leading cause of impairment to those water bodies, which impacts both the quality and quantity. So preventing pollution, just like with anything else, prevention is much easier than coming in after the fact and mitigating the damages caused by that. A lot of the regulations were spurred by historic events like the Cuyahoga River fires. For anyone interested in those stories, I encourage you to look that up. It's very interesting. That river was so polluted in the 50s and 60s that it caught on fire 15 or so times, and they actually had a lot of signs saying flammable river, do not get in. And that was because of unregulated dumping into our waterways. Um, Very interesting read. It ended up on Time magazine and got a lot of press. That was how folks got their information back in the day. So a public outcry kind of happened, and of that was born the Clean Water Act. So it was first passed in 1972 during the Nixon administration, and they actually created the EPA to administer the Clean Water Act and run enforcement for it. And under that act, they established the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES. So that is the program administered by the EPA. And the EPA delegates responsibility to the states. So the state of Oklahoma has their own program, and that's just called the Oklahoma Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, OPDES for short. It was amended in 1987 to address diffuse sources of pollution, such as stormwater discharges. And that's when they really discovered how much pollution was going into the water simply from runoff generated from rainfall. The goals of this amendment was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And they wanted all the nation's waters to be swimmable and fishable. So I'm sure anybody can take a stroll through Stillwater, and there are several water bodies here that do not look very appealing to swim or try to fish out of. And that is something that we want to work to correct. So just an overview of how all the agencies kind of interact with each other. The EPA is at the top. They delegate authority to the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality. The ODEQ then issues a permit called the OKR04, and that is the municipal permit that we as a city are subject to. And that dictates everything that we do with the stormwater management program in relation to water quality. There are two other permits that we are responsible for, not necessarily administering, but making sure that developers have them and industries have them and that they are compliant with them. And then we are solely responsible for 6 minimum control measures. On the left side of that, you see 6 MCMs. That stands for minimum control measures. So just a little bit of background. Our first permit was issued in 2005. That's whenever we started having to do things as a municipality. So a lot of people that I talk to, they don't know that we're responsible for this kind of thing, and that's because it has not been around forever. We're about 15 years in now, so we still have a lot of work to do, but we do have a program that is continually developing. The permit was reauthorized on March 1st of 2017, and we're up for another reauthorization in 2020. And it requires the development and implementation of a stormwater management plan. That's very important to what we're doing and what we're talking about today. So this stormwater management plan that we're responsible for, it specifies the activities that we as a city will take to minimize stormwater pollution. It's implemented citywide, everywhere within city limits, as well as Lake McMurtry. And it addresses those 6 minimum control measures listed here. So we have public education and outreach, public participation and involvement, illicit discharge detection and elimination, which is basically me going out looking for pollution and trying to find the source. So that is a very labor-intensive portion of what we have to do. Construction site stormwater runoff control. This pertains to a lot of the sediment and erosion controls that you see on construction sites, and making sure that what's on their site stays on their site. Post-construction management. This is primarily pertaining to retention and detention ponds and making sure that they're being maintained properly and still functional over time. And then we have pollution prevention, good housekeeping for MS4 operations. So this is more of us setting a good example for everyone else. Each one of our facilities is required to keep pollution prevention protocols in place, such as spill prevention and general housekeeping. Really, it boils down to just keeping the facilities clean. So moving on, we're going to talk briefly about impaired waters. This is kind of what dictates the regulations stricter regulations above and beyond these 6 minimum control measures. So Section 303D of the Clean Water Act requires states to develop lists of impaired waters, and those impairments are determined by the water quality standards that each individual state comes up with. So for our state, the Oklahoma Water Resources Board sets water quality standards, and we have to try to meet them. Each state establishes a priority ranking for impaired waters, and the state develops what's called a total maximum daily load. That is basically a very extensive, thorough study of a water body. They determine what pollutants are present, what is causing those pollutants, and they issue new regulations to the owner, which in our case would be the municipality, to try to reduce those daily loads of pollutants going into the water bodies. So as of right now, we do not have any TMDLs, which is a fantastic thing. So this is just a general map. You can see there are 8 different watersheds. These are each of the individual primary creeks that run through Stillwater. Each of these watersheds ultimately drains into the Stillwater Creek watershed. So that's very important to keep in mind that when we look at this, we want to look at the Stillwater Creek watershed as a whole and not really try to break it down into smaller individual parts as best as we can. So water quality trends for Stillwater. Every 2 years, the state writes a report and sends it to the EPA. In the report for 2014, we had 2 waters listed as impaired waters, and that would be Boomer Lake and Stillwater Creek. In 2018, it's the most recent addition sent to the EPA. We have doubled that to 4 impaired water bodies: Boomer Lake, Stillwater Creek, Boomer Creek, and I have Sanborn Hazen Lake Creek here. I apologize, Monty. That one is known locally as West Boomer Creek. A lot of the entities write it out as Sanborn Hazen Lake, so I try to keep terminology with what they use on all of our reporting. So in general, water quality has gone down in our city. We'll move on to the potential TMDLs that could be coming out. That is for Boomer Lake and Stillwater Creek. So the state has listed these 2 waters on the list of waters that they want to start the TMDL process. It's very important that we try to get these removed from that 303D list before a TMDL is issued, because that TMDL comes with more and more unfunded mandates that we will be responsible for. There's only one known TMDL that has been imposed on municipalities in the state. That is for Lake Thunderbird. And I believe the city of Norman, Oklahoma City, and Midwest City all share some responsibility for that TMDL. But I can tell you that the city of Norman is responsible, one of their requirements, of removing something to the effect of 26 million tons of sediment going into that lake each year. So if you want to think about the sheer mechanics of trying to keep that much sediment removed from Thunderbird, we really don't want anything like that for any of our water bodies. That's going to be a serious cost for us. So what do we do as a municipality? Going back to those 6 minimum control measures, we'll just briefly touch on these. For public education, we do council presentations like this. We do school presentations where we go and talk to individual classes. Touch a Truck events are very popular. We just set up in the parking lot, and kids love to come around and learn about the water quality testing that we do. We have some lab equipment set up, and they seem very enthusiastic to learn about the science behind it, so that's exciting. And then we have special events such as conferences. We had the Oklahoma Clean Water Lakes convention in Stillwater every year at the West Watkins Center. It was canceled this year, but we typically will sponsor that event, set up a booth, and talk to any of the vendors, any of the people that come by. So we love going to special events. Public participation and involvement. We have a group called the Blue Thumb Volunteers. They do water quality monitoring, any kind of stream monitoring, and it's completely volunteer basis. They go through training. They have to get certified to know what they're doing so that their water quality samples are of good quality and can be used. We also do stream cleanup events, citizen committees, and moving on to illicit discharge detection. We have a dry weather field screening program, which is basically I go look for anything flowing in our ditches during dry weather when there shouldn't be anything flowing. If there is, I try to track down the source and put an end to it if it does prove to be a pollutant source. And we also have storm sewer camera inspections. Construction site runoff control. We have ordinances and design standards. We have a permitting process known as the earth change permit that requires these developers and contractors to do certain things on their site. And we do inspections on these sites and occasionally have to move towards enforcement if we can't bring them into compliance. Post-construction runoff, again, this goes to permanent water quality structures and water quantity structures as well. So detention and retention pond inspections, as well as general property maintenance issues. Pollution prevention, again, that applies to city facilities and standard operating procedures for each of those facilities. So now we'll kind of get into water quantity. This is just a brief graph. I pulled this from the Mesonet site today. The general blue, those are the long-term averages of average rainfall throughout the year. And the red line is where we are so far this year. So we're slightly above average on our rainfall. It varies from year to year. I'm sure everyone remembers last year we were well above average. We had something to the effect of 52 inches. We're a little above average now, but we still have plenty of the year to go, and we can never really predict how much we're going to receive. So how do we manage the quantity of water that we get? We do that through an extensive network of natural creeks, underground storm sewers, natural surface drainage channels, structural surface drainage channels, so concrete channels. You might see rock gabion walls. Duck Creek is a good example of this over by Ridge. We have street right-of-way ditches, Lake McMurtry and Boomer Lake, a series of detention ponds, retention ponds, as well as underground storage that is becoming popular in new development where they don't really have the space to do surface detention ponds. Basically a large underground holding tank that releases the built-up stormwater over time. So who maintains this network? If it's on public property, sewer infrastructure and drainage facilities, it's going to be Public Works, that two-man drainage crew that we talked about, as well as new improvements that come through from time to time, such as the current CDBG project, where we're going to try to make improvements to 12th Avenue. Drainage facilities located on private property are the responsibility of the property owner. This is something that I have run into quite often, that most property owners believe that all creeks and drainages belong to the city. So this is a very important message to get out, that our city ordinances do require property owners to maintain any kind of drainage facility that they have on their property. If it's in a right-of-way or we have an easement, it is a possibility for us to go in and work on that. But for the most part, smaller issues would be the property owner. So another part of managing the quantity is tied into floodplain management and hazard mitigation. You can see the attached floodplain map. It is not very detailed, so you can find this map on our website. You can find it on the FEMA website as well. But the three priorities for managing the quantity come with identifying flood risks, and that's done through flood mapping, mitigating the flood risks through city ordinances and design standards, and insuring against the risk by making sure that we provide, but that flood insurance is available to all residents and property owners within city limits. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So in identifying the risk, these maps are generated by FEMA. They are based on hydrology and hydraulic analysis, and the flood zones are typically delineated along contour lines. So you'll see a very sharp line on these floodplain maps, and it's very important to understand that if you have a property just outside of the flood zone, flooding does not listen to the contour line, right? So the water is going to go if there's enough water. So these are used to approximately identify your risk, but you have to have some common sense when interpreting these maps as well. Like I said, they're available at this website for FEMA, msc.fema.gov. We have a link on our Mapping Stillwater webpage where you can view those FEMA maps. And you can also contact the local floodplain administrator, which if you live within the city limits, that's me. Feel free to call me anytime. If you live outside of city limits, the Payne County floodplain administrator is also available for questions. So mitigating the risk, we're going to look at city ordinances in Chapter 23. We're not going to go into each ordinance, of course, but it limits the amount and nature of activities allowed in varying floodplain zones. There are typically 3 different zones that are of primary concern for us. Number 1 is the floodway, where we do not allow any development apart from necessary improvements for utilities and things like streets, bridges, infrastructure. We have the 1% annual chance, Zone AE, which was previously described as the 100-year flood zone. They're trying to move away from that terminology because people assume that if they got flooded this year, they have another 99 before they have to worry about another flood. So that's a misconception they're trying to get away from by renaming it the 1% annual chance. And we do have specific building requirements for any development going on in that zone. And then you have the 0.2% annual chance, Zone X, previously known as the 500-year floodplain. It is unregulated. That does not mean that you don't have a risk of flooding. I want to make that perfectly clear again. During the May 19 events, the Oklahoma Water Resources Board reported that the majority of flood damage claims came from this unregulated zone, so outside of the typical floodplain zone. So no one is exempt regardless of where you are on those maps. So insuring against the risk, the City of Stillwater participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. This was developed because FEMA was losing millions and millions of dollars in paying out damage claims. So they came up with this program. Communities have to participate in this program in order for FEMA to make funds available to those communities. It makes flood insurance policies available to all residents, regardless of the floodplain zone status. And communities must adhere to NFIP regulations in order to participate. We can be kicked out of this if we loosen our regulations and do not comply with this. On top of the NFIP, the city participates in what's called the Community Rating System, which is an incentive-based community program that provides discounts on insurance premiums for us exceeding the minimum NFIP requirements. So when looking through the city ordinances, you'll find that we are more stringent than the basic NFIP regulations. And due to us being more stringent, we're able to get, I believe, somewhere around a 40% discount for any flood insurance premium for residents in Stillwater. So it's very important that we keep that up. It helps lower rates for everyone interested in that flood insurance policy. So the current plans in place that are tied in with this include the hazard mitigation plan. We've had several meetings about that lately. It addresses all potential hazards to Stillwater, from tornadoes, flooding, earthquakes, extreme drought. And it identifies flooding as a likely event, and it contains a list of mitigation measures that we can apply for federal grants for these particular mitigation projects. This is very important. Hopefully we can come up with some federal grant money to do some of the things on this list. We've had some public meetings, not a lot of turnout, but feel free to get in touch with the SEMA department, the Emergency Management Department. They are overseeing that hazard mitigation plan, and we have a lot of information available to the public for anybody that's interested. Also, we have the Stormwater Master Plan. So this comes back to the MS4 requirements and has a lot to do with the floodplain requirements as well. This addresses water quality and water quantity throughout the entire watershed. So we're naming this plan the Stillwater Creek Watershed Management Plan. Like we said earlier, everything drains to the Stillwater Creek watershed. So we wanted to look at this at a watershed level and not separate it into individual groups, because everything is tied together and we have to look at the big picture. And this Stormwater Master Plan will identify and prioritize areas for drainage improvement projects. and it will identify potential funding sources, so additional federal grants that may be available for us to complete these projects. As an update to where we are in this master plan process, we currently are in the middle of the stormwater utility feasibility study. So we're looking at the current rate structure, again, going back to that $1 residential fee and the $5 to $55 commercial fee. We're looking at the expected level of service that the general public expects us to be doing. And we look at ways to make that an equitable plan for everyone throughout the city. We have a channel maintenance system mapping program going on that is being led with OSU graduate students. So we're saving quite a bit of money by not having to use environmental consultants and pay their hourly fees. We're trying to build a relationship with OSU, and I think this is a great opportunity to utilize the power that they have. Of course, it's all supervised. They're all fully trained on the equipment they're using, and they're essentially going through all of the open channels in the city of Stillwater. They're looking for any areas of significant erosion along the banks, any downed trees, any damaged infrastructure, and they're putting this on an interactive map for us. And these areas will eventually be prioritized, and we'll have a system in order saying, start here, fix these problems first, and move down the list as we go. This is going to be an interactive map that is hopefully going to be available to the public whenever it's ready to put out. And it's pretty exciting. We got a little bit of a view of it last week during a conference call with Mishek Engineering, who is in charge of this master plan. And it's pretty exciting to see what they're coming up with. One of the other programs we've got is another agreement with Oklahoma State University, and that's our water quality monitoring program. The reason we wanted to really investigate this and look into what it would cost for us to have our own monitoring program is based on the fact that all of the data that goes to the state and ultimately to the EPA is coming from the volunteer groups that we mentioned earlier, as well as the NRCS, and some of that data is very sporadic. Depending on when they monitor, it may not show the actual average conditions of the stream. If we just got a heavy rain and they come out and take samples, that's not really showing the true nature of what's going on in that creek. So if we have this program, we can come up behind them, we can get our own data, we can submit it for use in that impaired water body list, and it gives us a little bit more leeway to really know what's going on in our waters rather than relying on volunteer program and not really having any say in what's happening. So this kind of gives us a little more control. It gives us a better idea of what's going on so that we can keep our finger on the pulse better. Just some general resources, which I always try to make available on any presentation that I give to the public. We've got the EPA website, the DEQ website, our website, of course. We have Blue Thumb OK, which is the volunteer organization. It's a great organization. If anybody's looking to join in volunteer work, get a hold of these folks. They work from the Conservation Commission, and they do some wonderful things. And they have a lot of education built into it. So it's a great learning experience, especially for kids, young adults, anybody that's interested. I encourage you to go look at them. And then we have sustainablestillwater.org. So that's all I have for the presentation. Here's my contact information for anybody that has any questions or concerns. Feel free to call me. Of course, with us not working out of the office during these times, the cell phone would be the best option to get in touch with me, but you can also leave a message at the office and it does get forwarded to me. Or feel free to send me an email. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to let me know.
Thank you very much, Zach. That's a comprehensive and very helpful look at the work that you all are doing over there, and I certainly appreciate it. Monty, did you want to add anything at the end of that? You're muted.
Okay, let me get unmuted. Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to add 3 points. The stormwater utility fee that was created in '97, Zach's correct in that it was to do capital improvement projects. But when it was created, the city can use the money for a lot of purposes, not just capital improvements. So through the years, as things have changed, those funds have been used for the things that they're appropriately used for. In other words, we did not divert funds from capital improvement to something else. We're utilizing the funds in the way that's appropriate. I wanted to point out that when Zach talked about no development in the floodway, except for utility and infrastructure, that's correct. But when we do go in and do things, we still conduct a floodway study to make sure we're not doing any harm. Example of that is Boomer Creek above McElroy. There's a sanitary sewer line that has to be replaced. It'll be a larger line. It crosses the creek. And we've asked the consultant to do a study of what the larger line does in that floodway, as opposed to just saying, it's not going to be any problem. So we do follow those requirements even when when we're doing the work. And lastly, I want to stress particularly MESHEC's involvement in the stormwater management plan that we're putting together, and Zach's comments about identifying potential federal funds. You'll recall last, I believe it was in November, Council approved a grant application for a hazard planning mitigation grant. And where MESHEC identified that and has moved forward, we believe we're in very good position to receive that grant. And that will study all of the Boomer Creek Basin down to 40 acres size of subbasins, develop drainage improvements that are needed, and then we'll perform a benefit cost analysis on those improvements so we can determine which ones are worthwhile to fund. But just wanted to make those additional comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Monty. Appreciate that. Counselors, questions or comments for Zach or Monty on this presentation?
Zach,
Yeah, I had. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just want to say thank you very much. I did not realize I could be that interested in the stormwater, and you made it simple for me to understand. And I'm always amazed at what I learn with these presentations. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll echo that by saying that was a masterclass of how these presentations should go, Zach. Held my attention. I didn't even doze off, and I understood about 95% of it. So well done, sir. I did have one question. Going back to one of the last slides that you put up about the rate structure study. I think you had said that right now our rates are a flat fee of $1 per household and anywhere ranging from $5 to $55 for commercial customers. When do you think that rate study would be completed? And Monty, you can jump in here too if whoever may have that information.
Go ahead, Zach.
A solid date as to when that structure would be updated. They're still going through the study. They're looking at all of our current costs and doing oh, sorry, I guess I was muted there.
No, we heard you.
Okay. So we're looking at the cost, and we want to make sure that this program is fully funded without having to draw from other capital funds or any other type of funds. So we're looking at a potential two-step process. The initial step is going to simply look at the money that we're spending to run these programs and to implement everything that we're doing. We want to make sure that's paid for. And then once the overall stormwater master plan is completed and we have all the data, we've got the priority list, we know the problem areas, and we have that list that we need to start working down for these improvements, we can take a look at a second step increase to make sure that we have funding for that. So that's in a nutshell. I'm sure Monty may have additional comments for that.
Yeah, the additional things I want to say is in our Zoom meeting last week, they presented the model they've developed, and they've identified all the costs basically cost centers of where we're spending money. And we're fine tuning some of those costs and verifying some of that information. They've also looked at the impervious areas and looked at the revenue side. And are we collecting as much money as we should be based on the impervious areas? And so we have some work there to do to work through some of that. But it's a very good model in terms of it's going to give us flexibility going forward and where we can adjust costs, where we think we need more costs, and then what that means. You push a button, and then that tells you how much money you've got to generate, and then it goes back to what the fee should be. It's a very, very sophisticated model. We're very pleased with it. But I would say we're well over 50% on that, where we should be. The fund right now, as Zach pointed out, on the areas that it's funded, pretty much is maxed out by those three uses, which doesn't leave us much for capital improvement, if any at all. The other thing we're looking at is we've plugged in how much money Public Works is currently spending on their on drainage and maintenance, but is that the right number? It's basically that's kind of underfunded. Other hit based on other communities and our drainage basins, maybe we should be doing more than what we're doing. They've identified some additional projects they could be doing with their forces if they had more money. But again, are we responding to just the squeaky wheels, or do we need more to really adequately maintain? So those are some of the big things that we're going to start looking at now. And but we've got a great base to start from.
May I ask a question?
Please.
In the beginning of your report, Zach, you mentioned that, thank you for orienting me. On the bottom of my utility bill, I have a drainage fee. Would I then assume that if you do not use our utilities, you do not have a fee? I mean, if you're in Stillwater and you are not actually a customer of ours, water-wise or...
That's a very good question, and that's one of the things we're looking into to see how many accounts out there probably should be paying this drainage fee, how many are not. So that's all a part of this feasibility study. We're looking at every parcel that we have using the GIS system, and we're identifying where those funds are coming from and where we need to focus on figuring out those deficiencies.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, Vice Mayor, the largest customer or the largest tenant, I guess I know of, that's not a customer of our utility system is the university, who also happens to have quite a few acres of impervious material. Monty, do you or Zach, how does the university contribute to the wastewater program?
I don't believe we collect any money from OSU at all, but we have identified what their impervious area is, and we would assume that'll be a discussion at a pay grade above ours. Time comes, but we will have the data for someone to have that conversation, and kind of follow up a little bit on Zach's discussion about going through and making sure that we have all the accounts identified. Councilor Darlington, that is an excellent point. Kind of the initial data shows that there's quite a bit of revenue should be coming our way that's not, and that could substantially reduce what the increase would be in the fee. So it is important that we take a hard look at that, make sure we're collecting from everyone we should be collecting for, so the rest of us are paying more.
Mm-hmm. Monty, one of the questions I had was how in the model and kind of looking at costs and expenses and that sort of thing that you guys are doing now, is there a way that you can sort of incorporate the extra expenses that we have to spend on transportation or in other areas of the city due to the current, issues we have with stormwater management or with, I mean, if there are parts of the city where roads are significantly, I'm thinking of the university, the sort of Westwood neighborhood area where we know there's significant drainage issues, and Duck and Miller sort of areas where we've had to spend extra money on those from a transportation perspective that we maybe wouldn't have if we would have been able to invest that money in projects earlier on stormwater management.
We have not identified a specific line item to do that. I think we could add that, certainly add that line item. Coming up with the realistic data to put on that line item would take some effort, but I think we could find that. And that would be part of Meshach's work in some of those other areas. What is the cost when they're looking at a basin? What is the cost to put in a storm sewer system? And then part of the benefits would be reduced maintenance cost in streets and those types of things. So that would be a component of those individual benefit cost analysis.
Councilors, anything further on this matter? Well, gentlemen, we appreciate, again, the very useful info and the clear and concise manner in which it was presented. So we'll look forward to talking more about this as we get farther into the study process and as more issues are identified. And it certainly seems like the kind of issue that long-term the city really needs to get a handle on. And we appreciate the work you're doing so far on it.
Thank you for that. And I want to brag on Zach a little bit. He understands particularly the water quality side of this very, very well. He's already identified in our next permit the impacts it's going to have to us on budget and other things. He does a really great job in this area.
Excellent. It's great to hear. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that will conclude that portion of the agenda, and we will move on to item 3B, which is our regular COVID-19 update. Although this one's not particularly regular, although none of them are. None of this is a normal sort of a process. So I think the best way to start here is just for me to give an update kind of on where we are from an emergency declaration standpoint, what the impact of the state's opening up plan seems to be at this point, and then I would really like to have a discussion with the council on what folks see as the best way forward for Stillwater, the issues that need to be researched or uncovered, and then what we'd like to see happen over the next couple of weeks. So as of last Friday, the governor modified his standing orders on this issue to start to open up some businesses, starting with personal care businesses last weekend, and also sort of removed changed a few of the things in his orders, including his 10-person gathering limitation and some other stuff. So, and then plans on May 1st to moving fully into what they're calling phase 1 of the reopening plan, with a bunch of other businesses, including restaurant, dining rooms, entertainment venues, movie theaters, gyms, and a few others. So in looking at that last week, in looking at the governor's plan, and then also in talking with other mayors from around the state and seeing what their announced plans were, especially Oklahoma City and Tulsa on Friday, and sort of getting the sense that for the most part, cities around the state, well, for all intents and purposes, all cities around the state, which we do have the ability to be more strict than the governor, it seems that everyone is choosing, at least from the standpoint of when to open and what types of businesses to open, to conform to the governor's plan. and reopen on May 1st, at least that first phase of businesses. I put out an announcement on Friday afternoon to that same effect. There's really a couple reasons that I felt like in talking with different folks why that seemed like really the only option for the city of Stillwater. Not, I don't think personally the best option, but given the widespread nature of the reopenings, continued closure of those businesses in Stillwater really has very little public health benefit, given the fact that folks here who are going to want to go out and eat and go to the movies and go to do all those things that they can do in other cities are going to go to those cities and do that if they want. And so they're still going to be out in public, they're still going to be interacting, and in many cases in areas that have much higher incidences of this disease than we do here in Stillwater. And so it's a minimal, if any, public health benefit for us to continue to keep those businesses closed. And in the sense of the economic impact on those businesses, while their peers in other cities are open, it seems particularly unfair to place that burden on our businesses when we're not getting what we would see as any kind of public health benefit. I think we would all agree that the economic detriment of the orders we've had in place and the business closures we put in place is only worthwhile overall if we're seeing public health benefit from it. And so given that sort of calculus, it doesn't seem beneficial to the city of Stillwater overall to maintain a shelter-in-place order with business closures to a larger extent than what the larger state and other cities in our state are doing. So the plan would be our current shelter-in-place order expires at midnight on Thursday. If lining up with the state, what seems to be what's happening in other places, we would let that order expire. We do have other existing orders that have those businesses closed, so we would have to issue an order that defines that or says what we still have closed and clarifies what's closed going forward based on those things. So there would be a new order that will need to be issued this week. So the question I think I have for you all and would love to hear your input on is going to be around, one, do you feel that we should keep a shelter-in-place order and business closure in place longer in Stillwater? If not, if we should go forward with this particular list that the governor has put together, and if so, what are the restrictions and guidelines we should give those businesses? There's really a lot to discuss, especially on that front, because there are so many different guidelines that seem to be out there about what standards a restaurant is going to have to meet in order to be open under these rules. It seems a little difficult, I think, for anybody to try to figure out what those are. And so at the very least, it might be helpful if we can find some standards to put in place here in Stillwater. But I will sort of open it up to the council at this point for comment or thoughts on the bigger picture and kind of how you see Stillwater moving forward.
Mayor, you know how unhappy I was Friday, and I am still, yeah, I'm still very unhappy that we have gone ahead and that we were put into this position. I'm sad that 4 really good mayors couldn't have gotten on the phone and said, we're not doing this, but it didn't happen. I understand the pressure that you're under, and I have respected and admired everything that you've done to this point, and I do not like to come across as a dissenting person. So I will just say I'm really unhappy that we're doing this. I think if we could have waited 1 week and at best 2 weeks more, we would have been in a much better position. I think that I don't know who has the right numbers, but testing and tracking are the most important things. that I have seen across the board as having to be in place. Testing that is adequate and available. And yes, we have a lot of testing capacity, but we don't have enough swabs. 30 to 72 hours for test results does not seem like the greatest access to testing. I do not know what the tracking is, what our capability for tracking is, and what our capability beyond tracking, isolating or quarantining people who have been exposed to the virus. So without those real numbers for not only Stillwater, and you've talked about this a number of times, Mayor, that we have to take a regional look. We are out here. Our hospital has a catchment of 185,000 people. Our hospital is the primary service provider for that area, and we have 7 ICU rooms. And besides thinking of ourselves regionally, the impact of OSU and the potential for 40,000 people coming into Stillwater in August, or if football actually starts, and do we know that? Do we have that information? And then, thinking if this, there's so many things we don't know that it's just totally a guesswork. Is this seasonal? Are we going to have a huge bump in October? I'm getting way off track here, but I understand our order will expire on the 30th. I'm disappointed. And because of that, I think that our restrictions have to be our guidelines, not guidelines. Our expectations for how businesses will operate have to be really clear and really straightforward. I think that's even as I've heard from business owners, they can't just start business. They've got to get a lot of supplies that are not really available. So the pressure on them to get themselves organized, which would have been, if we would have said, 2 weeks from now, we're going to start this, they might have had a little bit more time. But, and I think we should look for our own selves at the businesses or places that people want to go to open. So I'll let somebody else take over.
Well,
I don't want to get too wound up here. I just want to be calm. I'm going to be really calm tonight.
I appreciate the disappointment, and I share it. As I think this is not what I would have chosen from a schedule standpoint for our community either. One of the things that does make it difficult is figuring out that area that we're supposed to be looking at when we try to figure out is stuff going well or not. Stillwater is in good shape. We've done a good job. Stillwater, the community, Payne County in general, has done a relatively good job of keeping this virus in check. Our hospital is not in a crisis situation as of today. Those are all great things. But it's difficult to say, nothing else about this virus has changed since March 15th when we put our first order in place, right? It still doesn't have a vaccine. It still doesn't have a viable treatment. It is still spread by people who are asymptomatic and don't know they have it. And so the idea of attributing a decline, if you see one in the numbers, to anything other than the social distancing and physical distancing rules that we've had in place makes no sense, right? The only reason it hasn't spread, given the factors, all of those factors, is because we have stayed away from each other. And the logical conclusion there is when we stop staying away from each other, we will see an increase in the numbers. Seasonality will potentially play a role in that, but there's no consistent science that shows what its seasonality will look like. There's no consistent science that shows that people who have had it before are going to be immune to it the next time. I agree. I think it's short-sighted and a poor decision to open on this schedule. From what you saw in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, I think there's a lot of communities in our state who feel the same way and feel forced into this timeline. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, and it will, I think, cause illness for people that wouldn't be ill if we didn't go forward with it. It's hard for us to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do it, right? I mean, honestly, it's easier for us at some level to stand up and say, no, we don't agree with this. We're going to stay with what we have. We're going to wait a couple more weeks. I think there'd be a lot of people. I think a majority of people that have contacted me, many more of them have been upset about us opening than they have been happy about it. Politically, at least locally, that seems like the easier decision. It's probably the right decision from a pure science standpoint, but at the same time, from a practical standpoint, it really, it's hard to see any practical benefit from us doing it other than to stand up and just, to make a moral stand on the issue. And I'm all for moral stands. I think it's important in a lot of ways, but at the same time, we're also taking a moral stand on the backs of our business owners whose money is going to some other town, and we're not necessarily seeing a public health benefit from putting that burden on them. And that makes that stand difficult for me. But I that's my opinion. I'm here to listen to you all's takes on that same question. Is it worth it for us to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do this?
Well, I'll jump in here for a second and just say that you're right. We're thrust into a difficult position here. Anybody that plays chess, the term for this is something called Zwischenzuck. There's nothing that we can do. We've been put into a difficult position with an inferior play on the board. And Mary, your points are well taken in the fact that from an economic standpoint, from a total economic well-being, I guess would be the term, there's not as much benefit of staying closed or keeping our restrictions in place going forward if we have a bunch of other municipalities right around us that are not going to continue to observe shelter-at-home orders, because our citizens in Stillwater will tend to egress to those municipalities and then come home. And so whether they're going out of their homes and staying in Stillwater, or whether they're going out of their homes and going to another local municipality, one or two of those scenarios is exceedingly likely. So the benefit from a public health standpoint of us continuing our restrictions as they were in place is kind of cut off at the knees, so to speak. We also have to weigh the fact that the public health aspect of this, has to be weighed against the economic impacts and the other health impacts of keeping people at home or shelter in place. And that's something that's a little bit more difficult to quantify, but is no less important in keeping our sites going forward and making our decisions. I will say that from a public health standpoint, if we take everything else off the table and just look at an infectious disease point of view, this is a bad idea. There's not a whole lot of way to split that. I haven't seen any convincing data to show a downward trend in our number of new cases in any of the data that I've looked at. Now, there have been several things that have tried to present data in specific ways, to use clever statistical tricks. But when you get down to to the core of the data, I have not seen any data set that has shown a consistent decline in our number of cases. And in fact, to the contrary of that, we continue to increase every single day over day since March 23rd. We have had a daily increase in our state number of cases. So from a public health standpoint, I think that this is hasty at best. When you weigh that against what everything else we're put up against, I tend to agree. I don't think that there's a good way out of this by continuing extreme restrictions, given the fact that nobody else is going to be following these restrictions. At that point, our restrictions almost become punitive, especially as it relates to business owners and people that are trying to follow the rules. And so going forward, like I said, I tend to agree that there's not a whole lot of utility in continuing our orders as they are in place right now when you throw everything into that pot. But I will say that I think we need to be extremely diligent and prepared to re-escalate restrictions at a moment's notice as numbers continue to be made available to us, because unfortunately this virus has an incubation period. That incubation period can be anywhere between 2 and 14 days. And so as soon as we start seeing an increase in hospitalizations, which I predict that we will, we need to be prepared to make decisions for re-escalation of restrictions very quickly. Because as soon as we start seeing that data, we're already behind the 8 ball because of that incubation period. So, like I said, your points are well taken, Mayor. We're thrust into a pretty difficult position here. But I would say going forward that one of the things that we need to be very diligent about and be ready to do would be to change course based on how we interpret data. And we need to be prepared to do that very quickly, especially in the early phases of this.
I agree. I think that re-escalation point needs to be part of kind of what we're looking at and figuring out when is that necessary. And given the fact that we were at least a few days ahead of when the governor felt that was necessary the first time, I think we should be prepared for the fact that we're going to probably have to be a few days ahead of it this time as well. And unfortunately, it's going to take seeing those numbers for people to realize it's a necessary action. And like you said, by the time we see those numbers, we're already past it. One of the graphs that the state has put up on their dashboard on the health department website is kind of interesting. It's not a great decision-making tool, but it shows cases by the date they first reported symptoms. So, if I went and got tested today and said, well, I've kind of been feeling bad since last Saturday, then they would put me on this graph if I tested positive as last Saturday. The 2 highest dates of people reporting symptoms are April 10th and April 20th, which, one is 7 days ago and the other is just over, 15, 16 days ago. And those numbers, for those days continue, at least for April 20th, they go up every day, because every time somebody goes in and gets tested tomorrow, they say, well, yeah, I've been feeling bad since about the 20th. That number is going to keep going up. It's clear, that there's that lag in the data. We're not going to know there's a lot more cases for a few days after that. And again, I mean,
well, and I
don't know what to do with it.
That's an interesting point too, and that just to one of my previous points is you really have to look at all of this data as a whole, because what that will do is that'll tend to pad the leading numbers, because your previous numbers can continue to go up.
Yeah. So
it
always looks like it's going down because people from yesterday and the day before haven't reported yet. So it looks, right. And I don't know why they have it up, because they don't have the governor's 7-day rolling average numbers that make it look like it's going down. They don't have that data up. They have this one up, And it's interesting data, like I said, but it shows us that we're several days behind knowing what's actually going on. And that's the danger, I think, in this approach, is that we're not going to know until an outbreak has happened. We're not going to know about it for a few days after that. And
Right.
It is, for all of these reasons, a bad idea from a statewide standpoint. I mean, I think one of the things we talked about early on is that we wanted a statewide approach, right? This is, to be entirely honest, these are not decisions we should be making from a city standpoint. This is a nationwide outbreak that needs to be handled from a much bigger picture perspective, right? If I'm just making decisions about Stillwater in Stillwater and I don't know what's going on in Ponca or Tulsa or Oklahoma City, and I don't have all that, somebody, this needs to be happening it needs to be handled at a statewide level. But unfortunately, those decision makers have been slower to act and quicker to open things up, and that's an unfortunate situation for us. But I say all that to say that I completely agree that we have to be, as a city, this is not us washing our hands of the issue, right? This is, at this point, saying we don't have a good option right now doesn't mean we're not going to have an option to act again in the future, right? We're not abdicating our responsibility to try to protect. It's just a matter of saying, do we have the data and a demonstrable public health benefit of that action that we can stand on to take it, and that's the part we're missing right now.
Yeah. Certainly not washing our hands of this. We're not even moistening our hands of this. Our hands aren't even.
We are washing our hands, though.
Gonna wash our hands.
We are washing our hands quite a bit.
All the time. Not of this issue, however.
So, okay, so if that's where we are, and none of us wants to be here, I don't think, but we're here, and so we've got certain businesses that are slated to reopen by the state's order over as early as Friday in Stillwater. There are a couple of, so the way the state has done this, they've put up some guidelines on the Department of Commerce's website for each sort of type of business that might reopen. This is where it gets confusing, because the order sometimes says some things. The governor in his press conferences have said some things. And then for certain businesses, like personal care businesses, barbershops, hair salons, they actually have the State Board of Cosmetology that regulates them as well, that has provided additional restrictions and rules. And so it's difficult for, I think, anybody who's kind of trying to figure out what is the rule for this place to know any one of 3 or 4 places they've got to go to find the rules. And I think from our standpoint, we should try to figure out what we can do about that.
And that was going to be my point. I mean, I ditto everything what everyone has said, and I'm not going to rehash all that. But if we are going to open and move forward, one of the most frustrating things for everybody in this whole process is not having clear guidelines, or not knowing that one area to go and look for so you can get an answer. I mean, it's just, you can look at different things and get different messages. And so is this a time then for us at the local level, for the mayors to get together, for city councils to get together, to say, this is how we're going to reopen the state. This is how we're going to do it. And so it's putting together or creating then a way for these businesses to get the information they need so they can decide, yes, I'm going to go ahead and move forward and open this, or no, you know what, at this point, I'm not going to. I mean, it just seems like we've spent a lot of time being frustrated about not having one place or the right set of information to do it. Maybe this is where our voice, and this is where we need to get together and say, this is how we're going to do it. This is their information. This is what, if we're going to open, then let's make sure we give our businesses the right information, one place to look. They're not confused. They're not frustrated, and everyone has the same expectation. It's different in Tulsa than it is in Stillwater. It's different in Harry than it is in, Guthrie.
I think one of the challenges, I totally agree. I think the possibility to confuse folks as they're opening is very, very high. They're just getting direction from so many places, locally, from the state, from their different professional boards. Vice Mayor Darlington and I were speaking with the churches and nonprofits, and certainly there are churches in town that have parent organizations that are even outside of, the state, that are passing down information and requirements for them as well. So we've heard from several franchises in Stillwater that are getting information from their parent organizations in terms of what the requirements will be. It's really challenging to think about how we give folks the right information, and if that's, is that an umbrella of information? Is that, do we try to get down into the weeds of that information? But I mean, the virus hasn't left us. The virus is still here. All this social distancing that we've been doing and doing well didn't get rid of the virus. So it's still here. None of that's changed, like the mayor said. And while we've put this enormous burden on our businesses to be closed this last month, we're now, I think, putting an enormous burden on them to follow these directives. I mean, if you are a gatherer of people or a business that brings people into your location, there's an enormous burden, I think, to protect your employees, protect the people that are visiting your location. It's just a new burden for them, I think. And we certainly, as we were listening to the churches, I think they feel an enormous responsibility to the people in our community to keep them safe. Particularly our churches that are gatherers of people. They felt, I think, overwhelmingly a more conservative approach was required for them. It's one of my big disappointments in the governor's plan that he's taken out the restrictions on the number of people that are permissible to gather. I think that's a real mistake. We know that gathering in large groups will be an easy transmission for this virus, and the ability to socially distance. It's challenging for folks that are opening their businesses. It's challenging for folks that normally gather people. I can't imagine being responsible for that on a day-to-day basis, and the amount of planning that will have to happen to do that effectively.
I wish there was a way we could. I don't think getting in the weeds is what is our responsibility, but I think if we could just figure out a way to kind of get everybody on the same page, so there is one place that people can go and find their area and figure out, here are the guidelines for X, Y, and Z, and click on that.
There's certainly, I went through the Department of Commerce website today and was looking through the various requirements or guidance. I guess that's the difference as well. A lot of the language that's in the Department of Commerce information is really stepped out as guidance. The language is very limiting in that way. It's very caveated as guidance or recommendations as opposed to actual requirements, which I think, again, can be kind of dicey for our community. We may have some businesses and entities that take it very seriously and do everything that's recommended, and others that, really struggle to meet those standards.
I think, I really like Elaine's suggestion of, can we get together and talk to these people? We're talking about Friday, so that's maybe not going to happen.
Right.
I mean, if we can name our level of phase 1, 25, no more than 25 people gather, no more than 10 people gather, no more than continue the 6 foot distancing, hand washing, gloves, absolutely masks required for employees and customers, anybody outside. And then I think Stillwater's small enough that, and maybe I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but the response of our businesses over the last 45 days has been, I think, remarkable. Our businesses, our churches, they're so creative, so thoughtful. And I also know, I mean, just look at me. Most of my friends are old. We don't go to places that don't wear masks. We don't want to do business with businesses that we can't tell. And a mask is, you wear a mask to stop your viral spread, but you also, in my mind, wear a mask to send a message to other people that you recognize that there still is a virus and that you are being cautious and conscientious about everything. I mean, it tells me you wash your hands. It tells me you, take care of yourself. It tells me a lot of things. So I have a lot of hope in our businesses for being thoughtful. If we have a level standard, now if their parent organizations are stricter, go for it. But that would be our
and I think start, yes, yeah.
Well, and I've kind of used this. So the federal government actually came up with guidelines, this opening up America again, that actually there was a lot of thought that was put into this. And I've kind of used this as my framework of where we, kind of my starting place in coming up with ideas of what we do at a local level. But, for example, it's a phased in approach. We as a municipality or as a state for sure haven't quite hit the phase 1 reopening guidelines on this thing yet, but here we are. So if we assume that we proceeded with phase 1 of this opening up America again, there's really only a few things that I personally would like to see changed in it. It's really well done as far as bullet points go. It's easy to follow. One of the things, for example, that I would recommend we reword would be, it says strongly consider using face coverings while in public. I tend to agree with the vice mayor that I think masks are, for me, a non-negotiable thing, especially when we're talking about reopening close contact businesses, such as barbershops, hair salons, things like that. To me, a mask is something that would seem to make sense as a requirement. But, my whole point here is that this outlines a pretty good strategy of phased in approach that I think that we could use as at least a jumping off point.
Well, yeah, and that actually brings up a good point, because phase 1 of the White House plan that you're referring to does include still limiting gatherings to 10 people or fewer.
To 10 people.
It does.
Yeah, and the state has very conspicuously removed any restriction on number of people. I mean,
phase 1 of this plan is definitely more responsible than our state's plan right now.
Yeah, and that it creates a lot of, I think, as Councilor Jaloski was saying, creates a lot of confusion from the standpoint of, it seems to say you can do just about anything. The state restaurant recommendations talk about banquets, and I can't imagine where in any of the guidance out there from any health agency that would suggest that was an appropriate thing at this point. And again, to reference the White House's guidelines, I mean, the state has said that that's what they're using as their base, but clearly they're not, because it does not include what the federal government has suggested needs to be in.
I think the key to actually both I much prefer also, Councillor Wedlake, the White House phasing plan. I think the idea, the gating criteria that they've established, and I mean, I think the Oklahoma plan, the hours plan that the governor rolled out, certainly is an echo of that. But I appreciated the more conservative approach laid out in the White House plan. But I think the language that both of these plans kind of dance around when we start talking about gathering people together again is this idea of whether or not you're able to maintain appropriate social distancing. And that, who knew a month and a half ago that we would all know what that means, but I think we all know that means about 6 feet apart at this point. I guess for me, what's challenging in the governor's plan is that it seems a lot of the events and venues that they're opening up, it's hard to imagine just the logistics of planning for 6 feet apart. As you look to open up recreational areas and youth sports at some point, I think the governor has that pretty early in his planning. It's hard to imagine how you logistically do that and feel good about how you've accomplished that. But even in churches, I think as we were speaking to the religious organizations, they were wondering how do we do this? Even if the governor's plan suggests every other pew, maybe that gets you 6 feet of distance, but how do you get people in and out of your church without coming face to face? How do you? It's really challenging. I think these large groups of people are where I really am struggling. I don't know what ability we have with the governor's plan to add any additional guidance or restrictions, or just, I don't know, how do we interpret that? But it's one of the things that I worry about the most. If we don't have any ability to look at that further and make that more clear for people, then I think, again, like everybody else has said, I think the idea of wearing masks, I know that's a hard thing. I think socially in our culture, it's just hard.
They're so pretty.
But we're going to have to get over it. It's going to have to be cool, because it's the kindest thing that you can do for our community and for your neighbors and for your family right now.
And that's a good, Councilor Josky, that's a really good point too, and something that some people may not understand, and the fact that the masks are not so much there to protect the wearer of the mask, they're there to protect other people around the wearer of the mask. It does help both ways, but a large portion of that infectious risk is taken down by those that are surrounded by the person wearing the mask. So you're right. That's a very good point, and that is a very kind thing that you can do for those people around you, because otherwise you're putting them at danger. And that's something that I think sometimes gets lost in translation, in that, well, I'm not going to wear a mask because I'm healthy and I feel fine. Well, great. I'm happy that you're healthy and feel fine. But that 75-year-old person standing next to you in line at Walmart isn't. They're at the high-risk population, and you not wearing a mask puts them at risk. If you want to boil it down to a constitutional issue, you are infringing upon their rights, right? So that's thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, the way I think about it, John, some people have said, well, if you're worried about catching the virus, just stay at home. Well, I could stay in my house for the next year and not contract the virus myself. But if other people are not being responsible out there, I can't get on an airplane or go to my church, because it's not about me staying healthy. It's about all of us staying healthy, in order to give all of us the freedom to do what we want.
And we're with the governor's plan right now, in this process of reopening it, it's really shifting to our own personal responsibility.
Right.
Right.
It's in each of our hands every day now. There's not a larger government restriction that's enforcing that. It's up to each of us every day. So I think, it's a small restriction to our personal freedom to wear a mask. I'll say it again, it's the kindest thing you can do for the people around you right now.
Yeah. I think when I said that testing and tracking were the two most important things, the third piece of that tripod is personal responsibility, and being able to recognize that what I do or don't do affects everyone else. And I
So-
don't, Mayor, I never mind if you want to take a moral stand on things.
Well, I would like to do that.
It's a no-win situation.
Yeah.
It really is.
I'm not here. None of us are sitting in these seats to, take our own moral stands on what we think, should happen in every situation. That should inform what we're doing, but we're also here to do what's best for the community. And it's hard for us practically. It's hard for me practically to see that be the best thing for the community at this point. I could argue that it is, but I could also argue that it could. As with everything here, there is not a clear answer. There is not a single expert anywhere out there that's telling us what we need to do. It continues to be insane to me that we at this level of government are attempting to make these decisions and being placed in a position where we have to try to make these decisions. But it is what it is, so we're going to do the best we can. Mayor, go ahead.
You were talking about having a hard time getting numbers. What kind of a relationship do we have with the health department that serves our county area? How do you get numbers from them?
We have a good relationship with the Payne County Health Department, which is part of Region 3. I think there's it's regional, right? So unlike Oklahoma City and Tulsa, the rest of us kind of share health departments among multiple counties. Mm-hmm. Kelly Rader at the Payne County Health Department has been great, very responsive, very helpful. She's got the same data the state's got for the most part. And so when we've asked to try to get more detailed data, the State Department has provided some of that. But they don't. I've asked a few times for the underlying data. Like, I want the spreadsheet. I don't want the chart, because every time we ask, we get a chart. And as we all know about charts, it just depends on who's drawing the chart, what it's going to say. So, the county health department too is not. From what I can tell, Kelly is not calling us up and saying, okay, here's the situation in Payne County. Here's what you need to do about it. Right? That's not the way this system is set up at all. They're doing contact tracing. They're doing testing. Again, locally, if we just look at our bubble, the hospital and the county health department feel like we're able to test the people who need to be tested right now. Now, we're still only testing people with symptoms, but even if you just have one symptom, you can go, make an appointment and go get tested. They are tracing. When someone tests positive, they're talking to that person, saying, where have you been? Who have you been in contact with? They're getting that information out so they can, help. That again, from a pandemic perspective or from a contagious disease perspective, is sort of the core function that has to happen. You have to go figure out who's got the disease. You've got to be tested, and then you've got to go figure out who did they come in contact with, so we can tell them that they may have the disease and we can contain it as quickly as possible. But having fast testing and fast contact tracing is necessary. From a local perspective, in our bubble, that seems to be going okay. Now, OSU test results are coming back in the shorter of that, 24 to 72 hour range for the most part, but that's not everybody. And again, this is an extremely mobile society, and we are at, from a Stillwater standpoint, we have lots of people who go to Oklahoma City and Tulsa every day. People who commute back and forth from Oklahoma City and Tulsa to Stillwater. Not to mention the smaller communities around us between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. So it's very difficult to just say, well, our bubble's okay, so everything's fine. Right? Because that's not the case in all of those communities. Mayor Bynum from Tulsa on Friday said, we do not meet the gating criteria. We do not have 14 days of consistent decline in Tulsa. We know that's the case. Bartlesville is extremely problematic. Broken Arrow is up there. Norman and Oklahoma City still have problems, that they don't feel like they're, necessarily seeing the gating criteria long term. So
the state as a whole has not fulfilled gating criteria,
and that's again, I mean, so to answer your question, Vice Mayor, we have a good relationship with the county health department. They provide the information they can provide. You know, there's some, you know, especially early on when we're saying, well, can you tell us more detailed data from a city level? They weren't allowed to release that. You know, the data now has been updated to show cities, I think, of more than 5,000 at least have a listing specifically for them. But it's a you know, it's a good relationship, and they're communicating with us. But at the same time, the limitations on what data is available are still there. And I don't, you know, I don't think our local health department is the problem from the standpoint of getting more detailed data. I will say that Oklahoma City and Tulsa both, in their announcements of moving forward in this direction, also indicated they wanted to be more restrictive. You know, Mayor Holt said where it's a suggestion, it's going to be a requirement in Oklahoma City. Mr. Dorman, I don't know if you've had a chance. I know John was talking to some of his counterparts in Oklahoma City and Norman and other places around to sort of see what their, you know, orders might look like coming out of this. I think there's a, you know, a good, as we've said before, it's good to have as much conformity as we can. Some communities, I know Broken Arrow basically said, we're dropping everything. We're just going to let the state, whatever the state says we're going to do. But other communities like Oklahoma City and Norman have said, we're going to try to be more restrictive. So we'd like to try to figure out from them what they're doing and see if we can come into some kind of alignment to again, give a little bit more conformity. John, I don't know if you've heard anything there or seen anything from them yet.
I'm still waiting on some items from Oklahoma City and Tulsa. I have been in contact with the city attorneys from Edmond and Norman and Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and so we're trying to work kind of collectively to put together some restrictions that are very easily understood and somewhat consistent in their application through those larger areas. So that should be coming hopefully late tomorrow or Wednesday at the latest.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that's a good network, and you know, talking to some of the mayors in those cities and working with city staffs has been a really good effort, I think. But I mean, we're talking about late Tuesday, early Wednesday for businesses that are trying to open Friday. Mm-hmm. But again, I mean, it's a timeline that I mean, we just don't have any any control over, and no. It's silly. I mean, I think for our local businesses, I've had a number of people that have reached out to me. Can we open? What are the rules going to be? You know, I think the best answer I can give them at this point is that if it says, if your business is listed in a state order as being able to open and it says it suggests that you do something, you should plan on having to do that thing. I mean, I think the state's guidelines are fairly comprehensive in the fact that they cover, you know, it talks about single-use condiment or multi-use condiments in restaurants, right? If it's a shared ketchup bottle on the table, you should consider taking that off the table. Well, you could just say don't put shared condiments on the table. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, right? I mean, I think restaurants understand that. They don't want to do that. I don't understand why the state recommendations don't just say you can't use shared condiments. You can't, you know, you can't use menus, reuse menus. You're going to have to print out a paper menu and just use one individually. Or you're going to have somebody that spends their whole night just sitting there with a bottle of Lysol and a rag and wiping off every menu every time somebody touches it. So it's difficult to provide much guidance from a business perspective. I know from what I can tell of the cosmetology guidelines, because of the state board, they've provided much stricter, you know, you've got to wear a mask, you can't let people congregate, you got to be spaced out. It's got, you know, I mean, there is more definite planning there and restrictions. And I think the folks who are planning on opening salons or barbershops, I think, have a much clearer picture of what that's going to look like. But I think that the retail stores, the restaurants, those other folks are still waiting for guidance. And, you know, we're working on it from the local perspective. We want it to be, I think it should be somewhat in line with other municipalities, at least, you know, so there is some conformity, even though some cities are going to say, whatever the state says, we're just going to use that. But it's going to take us another day or so to really kind of get that in line. I mean, I think again, the best recommendation is if the state's recommending it, or your association is recommending it, or your franchisor is recommending it, you should do it. Like that should be taken as we absolutely should do this. And that includes, you should encourage the use of masks. Well, you should require the use of masks for people that come into your establishment. You should tell your patrons that if they're going to come and shop in your store, they need to be wearing a face covering. Your employees should all be wearing face coverings. But we've got to take a little bit more time to get all that stuff written up and out there.
Do we feel very confident that, like the cosmetology, are they getting, is that going directly to each of those businesses? Do we, is this information being disseminated out? Like if you're a, beautician, are you automatically on an email list somewhere that you're getting this information from the cosmetology board?
As far as I can tell, that they have, but I don't know what the actual mechanism is.
I don't know if it's an actual email, Amy, but I know that they have to have relations with them in order to keep up with their licensure and all of that. And so they have direct contact and ways to interact with them. So yes, it's not an ambiguous thing out there for them, because you have to keep up with.
Is it worthwhile for us to consider, starting to pull together a clearinghouse of those, if you go to the state website, it gives you the general open up and recover safely plan, and then it directs you to the Department of Commerce, and there's got the different bullet, and they say they're going to be constantly adding to that. But do we need to start, if we have the cosmetology board, do we need to start to pull that into, it's really hard to imagine. I can't imagine being a business right now. I just cannot imagine how challenging this must be to think like, do I have like the latest and greatest from this, that, or the other person that, has some sort of control over how I run my business right now?
I think we could pull that sort of a web page with links together relatively quickly. The state plan, if there's a board that governs it, a link to theirs, and then if there's an additional requirement from the city of Stillwater, we would put it right next to that. I think
obviously it'd probably be a work in progress.
Yeah, it's gonna, and again, we're talking about over the next couple of days before this stuff's supposed to start opening. I think, that pulling those links together is not that big of a deal. I think the question for us is coming up with the additional requirements that Stillwater might try to impose on some of these things.
I don't know that I would like to call it additional requirements. I think we should have our requirements, our minimum requirements.
Sure.
And what we really expect, and then what the boards, they may be stricter or less strict, but our requirements are not additional. They're just what we're proposing.
Yeah. I would urge us to utilize the federal guidelines, talking about uniformity. I think that's a good place for us to start at the very least.
Yeah.
Because this is something that'll apply to everybody in the country. So certainly everybody in the state.
There's that contradiction though between, gathering, you can't gather more than 10 people, but you can go to church. You can't gather more than 10 people, but you can go to a movie theater. You can't gather more than 10. There are so many, in the governor's plan, starts talking about sports venues and stuff. That's where we're gathering more than 10 people. So I just don't know, how do we help those folks do that in a way that is safe? And I think that's a big contradiction between the federal plan and this plan. And I think the other thing I have in my notes to bring up is, this is just an arbitrary date on the calendar, right? The governor has lifted these restrictions just because the calendar is, rolling to a different day. And a lot of the emergency declarations that were in place by municipalities around the state were set to start to expire. The way that the White House criteria, the federal criteria is set up in terms of gating, it has a time period as opposed to a date. One of the things I'm disappointed in the governor's plan is that he starts to attach dates to phase 2 and phase 3 in terms of reopening. And I worry about folks that are in those phase 2, phase 3, either businesses or operations saying, moving ahead and thinking like, well, it says May 15th, so I should be able to be doing this by May 15th. I think we really need to be cautious to say, we will do this when we meet this next set of criteria. And we're measuring that in 14-day increments right now based on the White House guidance. We're looking at that again every 14 days.
The bowling alley, I think, would it be included in that? We're going to have to just sort of walk through those here over the next day or so and try to figure out what exactly those things need to say. I mean, I have no idea how the bowling alley deals with reusable bowling balls. You just take all the bowling balls out of there, or is someone wiping them down every time somebody touches a bowling ball? I mean, that's a difficult issue. There are within the just to cover the issues. I think the big issues that we still have with what the state is saying is that this idea that there is no restriction on meeting sizes, that's basically been removed. It just says you should try to avoid large gathering. I don't think that's feasible. I think there's got to be something in there that gives people some direction about what sizes should be. But again, then that creates a particular problem, because who does it apply to? The governor has indicated churches can reopen, but should it only be 25 people in a room?
Well, and do you even have to put a number on the total number of people that can be in a single gathering, as long as you're maintaining appropriate social distancing? I mean, I think that's the core of, or the most important thing is maintaining your distance from people. So there are venues where you can do 1,000 people together and still maintain 6 feet of distance. Now, how feasible is that in practice? Probably not very. But I think the crux of the matter is that we need to ensure that there's appropriate social distancing. The number of people at any single gathering seems a little bit more arbitrary in that context to me.
I think it depends on I think the John Hopkins University study that kind of showed, there's a high intensity, in a church building, right? There's lots of people, they're normally very close together, but there's a moderate ability to adapt your positioning of people in that building. So somewhere like a church may be able to satisfy a social distancing measure because they're able to modify, and we all kind of stand in one spot-ish during church, right? Whereas if you look at a concert venue, or I don't know, maybe a sporting venue potentially as well, people have a tendency to intermix and mingle, not necessarily stand in one spot. Your ability to adapt for social distancing is much more challenged in those circumstances. I just don't think the governor's plan has a good solution to that. I think it's really, really muddy, and I think we're going to have a lot of people that are, rightfully so, eager to get back to life again, but not very successful in maintaining those social distancing, and getting those in large groups is frightening to me, at least in this first phase of reopening. It seems like we're setting ourselves up for failure.
I think that's an important point, Amy. This is phase 1.
Right.
And if we have all agreed that we were not happy with starting this now. So phase 1 is going to be really cautious. We're going to have no more than, and I think that it's much easier for people to understand 25 people or 10 people than 6 feet apart. Our natural our natural togetherness, we start moving together.
Mhm.
And so I think, we have to say, this is phase one. We're going to look at the data, hopefully not in retrospective, but more aggressively ahead of the curve. We know we're going to have a spike when this goes into place, and be prepared for a reevaluation in 3 weeks. And we'll either be able to lower increase the numbers of people that can gather, or go to just 6 feet apart recommendation, or we'll go back to 10. I mean,
well, and if we put a distinct number on the distinct limit on the number of people that can gather, I think it's important to still add that 6 feet of.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not either or. It's
right. Yeah.
Well,
I think that's what the federal plan says. There are some contradictions in the federal plan as well, in terms of it does allow for the opening of churches as long as they maintain social distancing, but it does suggest a limitation of no more than 10 people in phase one.
Yeah.
So I don't know again, it's a little challenging. You can gather in some circumstances, but not in others. And maybe they're just trying to limit our social gatherings, or, things like that. I don't know how we move forward. I mean, if we say 10, are we then limiting churches, or are we saying 10 besides churches? And I think the governor's plan opens up recreational facilities in this first phase, if I remember right.
It says outdoor recreation and I think sports venues. I don't really know what that means. Is he trying to open Chesapeake Arena and get the NBA? I mean, I honestly have no idea what.
Well, and then phase two opens up, which he has slated for May 15th, I believe. It opens up actual youth sports activities.
So what is happening in the first one? I don't. That's the part here. Is it makes it very.
And that's opportunity for us to be clear, right? We consider X, Y, and Z to be sports venues. Therefore, under the governor's plan, they're open. And that's what these are sports venues in Stillwater. I don't know if we just need to provide some clarification.
I think they were thinking of golf courses at some level, or maybe that was what they were thinking of, an outdoor recreation facilities. Yeah, golf.
I would love to be able to say, if we're thinking of specific things, park and golf and tennis, pickleball, those are sports that people are spread out from. You can have 6 feet of difference. Now, if you're talking about basketball I think we'll get into trouble if we start parsing these things out and saying, you can't play basketball, but you can go golf.
Right.
If we actually say 6 feet apart, you have to be able to 6 feet apart. Now, if you can play basketball 6 feet apart, other than playing horse,
just play horse.
Just play horse.
It's more fun anyway.
But I think that's also important when you talk about gyms. There are gyms where you can go in and lift weights and be 6 feet apart. And there are gyms that you're doing jujitsu or boxing or some type of martial arts that your body is right on another person's body. So it just, again, though, it's difficult to go through and just pick out each little place that we think, I think it's most helpful to say, you have to be able to be 6 feet apart. And it's 10 people. And a virus doesn't know if you're at the Presbyterian Church or at Lowe's. So it's 10 people or whatever.
Certainly the guidelines put restrictions on, maximum occupancy, or the idea of if you're a restaurant, you're looking at your dining space and you're saying what can how many people can I seat in this dining space and maintain those social distancing measures. I think for the retail stores, there's also some guidance in terms of, what's your overall square footage and how many people can you, effectively maintain that social distancing in those. And there's just a lot of logistics planning for these folks as they start to open back up. They might be really up for the task and ready to go all in. I know in our Stillwater community, we care a lot about each other. So I'm certain that they're preparing. It's just, it seems daunting, and I want to help them in whatever way we can in helping make it more clear.
Yeah, when we just had essential businesses open, but we still had issues, with Walmart being packed or Lowe's being packed. One of the things we pulled together was that social distancing protocol that kind of listed all of the sort of areas and the things they needed to be considering, and had them fill out a form that says, this is how we're handling that issue. And we made it at that point voluntary for the most part. I mean, we asked them all to do it and post it on their door, but we didn't collect the forms and check them and make sure that they were taking the precautions they needed to take. But I think that's a platform we could continue to use in this setting, because it is so hard in one gym versus another gym, depending on space and what they do and how they've got their set up. What one of them might have to do to meet the social distancing guidelines is not going to be the same as another. And trying to fit a one-size-fits-all standard is really difficult. So we could use that kind of a setup and say, we want you to address all these things. We want you to post it publicly. We want people to understand that they should go look for that and make sure that those things are being followed. And even look at it on the door and say, well, this place isn't doing enough. I'm not going to go in. That may be one way for us to help handle the ambiguities and the differences between all of these different individual places.
I really like that idea, Will. I think that's a good idea. I think it kind of organizes maybe people's thoughts around it, make sure that they're kind of spending the time to do those logistics, and hopefully it would make people feel more comfortable soliciting those businesses. I mean, I think that's going to be the other challenge for our businesses as they open up is, our comfortableness going and shopping again. So maybe something like that wouldn't just be a burden on a business, but also a help to a business in order for them to show we are being responsible and thinking about our customers and our employees.
I agree.
So we will work on what that might look like. We will work on what other, what Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Norman, some of these other places that have talked about having more restrictive things in place, what they might be doing to try to see if that makes sense here too. I think a couple of the other issues that we probably need to address. I mean, when it talks about outdoor recreation, that sort of stuff. I mean, from a city perspective, I don't think we have any plan at this point. And since, city-owned facilities, we get to make those decisions about whether we're going to open them or not. I mean, I think the Armory and playgrounds and some of those places where we definitely know there's a more, enclosed or close contact possible, that there's no reason for us, I don't think at this point, to open those things back up. I think we might look at things like tennis courts, which we currently have closed, because you share a ball, but you certainly can keep distance apart. But other than that, I mean, city facilities. I know the city of Tulsa indicated that they were not planning on opening their pools at all this summer. I don't think we plan to do that either. I don't know what the YMCA's plan is for when they might open their facility, if they're going to open their pool sometime soon or not, but we certainly look more into that. But just some of those additional issues are ones that we're going to have to address as well. And, I think the other thing to remember, we've talked about this a couple times, right? I mean, if necessary, we will act to step back if needed. but there's also, you know, I mean, if we get into this and we go, oh, well, that doesn't really need to be in place. I mean, we can always amend this stuff as we go forward too, right? None of this is set in stone. None of it is, you know, one size fits all, or it's got to be in place by this date. I mean, we want to give business owners, especially, as much notice as we can. You know, unfortunately, we're on a pretty tight window here, but we do want them to feel like there's some predictability. I think that's going to be really tough over the next few months too, though, because of that potential insurge and having to step back. You know, for business owners, that it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster here, or it could be. So we need to try to get as much clarity out there as we can, as quick as we can. I think we also need to start talking about and looking at what is a step back. You know, what would it take for there to be a step back? Is that a number of hospitalizations number? Is that a per capita cases number? You know, I want to talk to the county health department and the state health department, if possible, about what, you know, when is the state health department going to recommend to the governor that he steps back? Is that do they have a number in mind, or is that just going to be a case by case decision every day when they look at it? I hope that's not the case, but I would like for us to try to figure out some triggers that are out there that people will know, you know, so when somebody sees it, they don't have to wait for us to try to parse it. They just know, okay, well, that's the number. That means we're definitely not moving forward, and maybe we're moving backwards.
Well,
Oh, those are the big picture things, but go ahead, Pat.
yeah. Well, I have a question about several of the plans keep vulnerable persons. And I hate to say I'm in that age group, but I am. Are we keeping shelter in place for 65 and over persons?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I mean that is in the governor's order, regardless of whether we do it or not. But yes, I mean we would keep that in place.
I'm not over 65, but we have a medically fragile family member, so we will be sheltering in place with you.
Good. Well, I hope that businesses also hear that. I have absolutely been blown away by how wonderful the groceries and retail and coffee shops have been for allowing us to call in orders and pay and just pick up by the curb. It's really been a very huge help for us.
It has been remarkable, hasn't it? We really haven't stepped foot anywhere, but we still feel very cared for and the ability to get the things that we need.
Right. Yeah.
We do need to just probably address the fact that, you know, currently with restaurants closed, parking is not really an issue, and we've put up sort of curbside, or the chamber has put up some signs to show, hey, this is a curbside thing. Mm-hmm. With restaurants opening, and I saw this in a discussion around the Hideaway, I think the Hideaway was saying they hope to reopen on Monday the 4th, but they still would be offering curbside. And so we may have to look, Norman, this is probably more for you than anybody else, just to say, I think we should still try as a community to make sure that curbside parking is available for people who are coming to pick up, even if that restaurant might be open. And so we may have to do a little parking thing with that to make sure people can do that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other questions I had was, I can't recall, maybe somebody could remind me, when we've put a hold on terminating utility service and things like that. I just thought, since things are starting to move forward, it might be good for us to just revisit what the dates are for that, and if there's any changes or anything we need to speak to. That was one of the other things that came with some of these emergency declarations.
Yeah.
The date that was indicated in the original proclamation was the cessation of an emergency proclamation. So as long as we're under a current proclamation, that would still remain in effect. But obviously, you're free to change that whenever you choose to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be, you know, again, even with this limited opening, you know, and I've heard a lot of restaurants saying that with 50% occupancy or whatever was going to be required, it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's not like it provides them with a huge economic benefit. I mean, it's better than nothing for sure, but it's still difficult to spoke to a barber today who also indicated that given the restrictions, it was going to be hard to cut enough hair to pay the bills on a given day. So there's still going to be, this first phase is definitely not solving the economic part of this by any means. But we do, and I know the city has put out, I think, appreciate the marketing department and Norman, your team's effort to communicate the need to make a payment plan for utility bills if you have to. Just because we're not turning them off doesn't, unfortunately, we're still paying for that electricity. We still have infrastructure costs, so those bills are not necessarily going away. And there are opportunities in the community. I know the Salvation Army, and you may contact the United Way and some other places that might be able to help with those. But we do need folks to continue to think about the fact that they need to try to find a payment option for utility bills in the meantime, because those are still unfortunately a reality for all of us. Norman, anything you'd like to add to this discussion since we've been?
Well, I'm kind of with John. We've attempted several times to get information from other cities so we could all kind of be on the same sheet of music, but the information's been slow in coming. I would like to ask the council a question as we wind down here, if we're winding down, that as we look at the reopening issues, it seemed to me as the consensus of the council was that the United States, the Reopening America, the White House plan is the one that we should kind of look to as the umbrella policy.
I think so. I mean, I think that's what the governor has said is his guiding policy as well. So, I mean, that it makes sense. I mean, I think from the standpoint of the doctors and the data, I mean, it's not a bad plan, and I think we should be doing what we can to follow it.
And it will be very easy for us to throw this up on a website, on a page. The problem is going to be when we get it, to get it installed. We can start working on that, but as you all have indicated during your discussion, things change pretty doggone rapidly with reduction in crowd sizes and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or increase in crowd size.
This at least gives it kind of a guiding point that they know that we're kind of all on the same page to say, at least look at the federal guidelines to kind of get you started. That way you're not until everything's out. It gives you a framework at least.
We need to work pretty fast to get our stuff on there before before we send anything out. I don't want to send anything out before we have our standards solid.
Sure. And, I mean, that stuff is up there for people if they were interested in looking at it. But yeah, I agree. I mean, from our communication standpoint, we want to figure out what it is we're going to say about Stillwater, and then, put that out as we can. And I just want to reiterate for those of you who are trying to figure out if your business is going to be open, or trying to figure out if your office is going to be open, if you can get back to work this week. This is a fluctuating situation and a timeline that is very short, and we're working, we'll be working as quickly as we can to try to make sure we get those standards out to you as soon as possible. Like I said before, I think the state guidelines are comprehensive in the fact that they seem to cover the types of things we'd be talking about, but I think at the very least you should assume that the most that things that are recommended will generally be something that we want definitely to be in place. And so if that helps planning at all, take a look at those for now. What else, counselors?
John, you looked like you were thinking of something else.
Me or John Dorman?
Oh, John Wedlake, you were.
Oh, my pondering face.
Okay, well, we will, as soon as we can, the staff can be working. I know John and the staff will be working on putting these things together, and we will get those out to folks as soon as we can. I appreciate the conversation and the dialogue tonight, Council. You know, a lot of this is decisions that get made, and we don't, you know, we're not able to have these conversations necessarily in the time frame that these things need to happen. So I'm glad we had a chance to kind of talk this through and get a sense of how everyone's feeling, and to try to get some consensus on how we need to move forward. And we will try to do that. That takes us to the end of the agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn the city council meeting?
Mayor?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Are there any reports from officers and boards? Yes, Mr. McNichol.
Yes, we talked a lot tonight about, well, council talked a lot tonight about face coverings. I wanted to remind people that both tomorrow and Wednesday, we will be giving out masks in front of the police department lobby. Tomorrow from 9 to 11 are those that are described as the vulnerable population can come and pick up a mask. And then from 11 to 2, it would be community wide. And then again on Wednesday from 9 to 2. And we would ask you, this comes from our citizens who have very kindly made a whole lot of these masks, and some others from donations. And we very much appreciate that, because, and let's call them face coverings and not masks, as in some cases the mask kind of generates a view of a medical procedure mask, and that's not always what they are and doesn't need to be. And if you'll go to our website, you can see a lot of links to what would suffice as a face covering that was discussed earlier. So at any rate, and one other thing that was discussed by council, and we just as well make official, is that the Couch Park pool will not be open this year. Long discussion with the Y about the ability to sanitize and the number of people. There's one of the things that I have concern is about with a big part of our 24,000 people that have probably left town. That big part of the hiring pool for the city of Stillwater, particularly in the summer. And there was a concern about being able to get qualified lifeguards. And at any one moment when that pool is open, they have to have 5. And they would have to be trained. And they saw that as problematic, in addition to the sanitation issues with chairs and railings and all kinds of things. So, unfortunate, but that will not be open this year. And we will look at the splash parks as the year goes by. There are organizations that look at that and make recommendations, and we will follow those.
Okay. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.
Councilors, any other announcements? Mr. Dorman, anything from you? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion from Councilor Wedlake and a second from Councilor Jaloski. Teresa, can you call the roll, please?
Mayor Joyce,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Darlington,
Yes.
Councilor Zanotti,
Yes.
Councilor Wedlake,
Yes.
Councilor Jaloski.
Yes.
With a vote of 5-0, the City Council meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for being here.